When Rachel Turner moved into her quiet suburban home, she thought she had finally escaped the chaos of city life. But on her third night, she noticed a stranger standing at the end of her driveway. He didn't move, didn't speak, and never left. Each night he returned closer than before until Rachel realized the truth that would shatter her sense of safety forever. It began on an ordinary evening, one of those quiet nights where the silence feels heavier than usual, pressing against the walls and filling every corner of the house. I was sitting on the couch with a television glowing faintly in front of me, trying to distract myself with meaningless noise. The screen flickered, but my attention kept drifting toward the windows. The night outside seemed darker than usual, so dark it looked like ink had spilled across the sky, swallowing the street and burying every familiar detail beneath its weight. I told myself it was nothing, just another night, but unease crawled beneath my skin like a slow-moving insect. I stood up, restless, and checked the locks on the front door, even though I knew I had already secured them earlier. My hand rattled the chain and pressed against the deadbolt until it clicked solidly, reassuring me with its firmness. Still, that wasn't enough. Something inside me insisted I pull back the curtain, just a little, to make sure everything outside was as it should be. When I did, my breath caught in my throat. There was someone standing at the end of my driveway. A tall figure, barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight, completely still as if carved from stone. At first I thought maybe it was a neighbor, someone taking a late walk, maybe smoking a cigarette. But the longer I stared, the stranger it seemed. They weren't moving, not a twitch, not even the faint shifting of weight from one foot to the other. It was as if the figure had been placed there deliberately, planted in the shadows for the sole purpose of facing my house. My stomach tightened as I tried to convince myself it was harmless. But the silence pressing in around me made that almost impossible. The television hummed behind me, casting a weak, artificial comfort across the room, but my eyes refused to leave the window. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again, hoping the figure would vanish like a trick of exhaustion. But it didn't. It remained, standing, watching. The curtain slipped from my fingers before I even realized I had let go, and it fell back into place, blotting out the sight of the driveway. I backed away slowly, as if distance could make the image disappear from my memory. My mind worked overtime, coming up with explanations that made sense. Maybe a stranger waiting for a ride, maybe a lost driver who had pulled over, maybe even just my imagination projecting shapes into the darkness. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of that frozen figure didn't match those excuses. It wasn't random. It felt intentional. I sat back on the couch, but the television no longer helped. Its glow only highlighted how dim and fragile my house felt, as if the walls weren't strong enough to separate me from the vast night outside. I turned the volume up, hoping to drown the gnawing fear in my chest, but even then, I thought I could hear something faint beneath the static of the TV, a sound too soft to place, yet steady enough to notice if I strained. It reminded me of the crunch of footsteps on gravel. My heart skipped. I turned my head toward the front door, but the sound had already faded, leaving only silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was nothing. I told myself that over and over, gripping the edge of the couch cushion until my knuckles whitened. But each time I repeated it, I believed it less. The house seemed to shrink around me, every shadow stretching long across the walls, every sound amplifying in the quiet. I felt like a child again, too afraid to look under the bed, too aware of the dark spaces where things could hide. My mind painted pictures of the figure moving closer, of it stepping off the driveway and crossing the yard, of it pressing its face against the glass while I sat helpless inside. I didn't dare pull the curtain back to check. Minutes dragged like hours as I sat frozen in place. Eventually, exhaustion crept in, heavy and unrelenting. My eyelids drooped, though fear kept jolting me awake each time my head tipped forward. I hated myself for feeling so powerless, hated the way my imagination twisted every creak and groan of the house into proof that someone was creeping closer. Finally, I forced myself into bed, pulling the blanket over my body like it could shield me from the night, but sleep brought no peace. As I lay there with my heart still pounding, I swore I heard it again, the faint crunch of footsteps on my driveway, slow, measured, and then silence. So complete it rang in my ears, stretching on and on until I couldn't tell if the sound had been real, or if my mind had conjured it just to torment me. When I finally drifted off, I did so with the certainty that something was outside, waiting. The morning light should have been a relief. The way it spread across the street and melted into the corners of my house should have pushed away the fear from the night before, but it didn't. I woke with a heaviness in my chest, the kind that comes after a nightmare, except this hadn't been a dream. The memory of the figure standing at the end of my driveway clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I went about the morning slowly, almost deliberately, as if dragging out the simplest tasks might help me feel normal again. I brewed coffee, washed a few dishes left in the sink, and tried to tell myself everything was fine. But the nagging unease only grew stronger until I finally gave in and decided to step outside. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that sharpens your senses. I scanned the street quickly, relieved to see nothing unusual, but then my eyes dropped to the ground, and my relief crumbled. The dew that clung to the grass revealed something I never wanted to see, Footprints. They were all over the yard, pressed deep into the damp earth. Not just one set, but many, circling the house in looping, uneven patterns. Whoever had been here hadn't simply passed by, they had lingered. They had walked around my home over and over, as if tracing it, memorizing it, staking some kind of claim. The strangest part was the inconsistency. Some prints were solid, clear impressions of a shoe pressed into the ground, while others were faint, as though a foot had barely touched the surface. A few seemed dragged, one heel sliding along like the person had been limping or shuffling. It wasn't random, it was purposeful. A tightness spread through my chest and I stepped back toward the door, every nerve urging me to get inside. The house that had felt so fragile the night before now seemed almost defenseless. Thin walls, glass windows, just a shell between me and whoever had been walking there. I closed the door firmly and locked it again, double-checking the deadbolt until my fingers hurt. I tried to convince myself not to think about it. I sat down at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, staring blankly at the dark liquid swirling in the mug. I told myself that maybe it was kids playing a prank. Maybe neighbors I didn't know wandering too close, but deep down, I didn't believe that. Those prints hadn't been playful, they hadn't been careless, they had been deliberate, circling like a predator studying its prey. The day dragged on in a blur. Every sound outside made me jump. A car door slamming, the rustle of wind through trees, even a bird tapping against the siding, all of it set my heart racing. I found myself glancing at the curtains constantly, making sure they were drawn tight. The sunlight didn't help anymore. Instead, it felt like a thin disguise, a fragile cover for something waiting just out of sight. By the time night began to fall again, dread had already built inside me like a storm gathering strength. I tried to lose myself in the glow of the television, turning the volume louder than usual, but it didn't stop the unease. My eyes kept shifting toward the window. My body was tense, bracing for something I didn't want to admit I was expecting. Midnight crept closer, and that was when it happened. The silence outside seemed to thicken, pressing hard against the house, muting even the faint hum of the streetlight beyond the glass. It felt like someone had sucked the air out of the world, against my better judgment, against everything screaming inside my head not to. I walked slowly to the window and peeled the curtain back. The sight froze me where I stood. The figure was back. This time it wasn't standing at the end of the driveway. It was closer, much closer, just a few yards from the front door, standing stiffly on the sidewalk, facing me. The distance between us had shrunk, and that felt worse than anything else. I couldn't make out details, not clearly, but the posture was unmistakable. Upright, waiting, watching, my heart hammered so hard I thought I might collapse from the sound alone. I didn't move. I didn't blink. The figure remained motionless, patient, as though it had all the time in the world to stand there in the dark. The curtain slipped from my fingers, cutting off the view, but the image burned in my mind. That presence outside, so close now, so deliberate. I staggered back and pressed myself against the wall, trying to quiet the panicked rhythm of my breathing. In that moment, I realized something that chilled me more than anything else. The figure hadn't just come back, it was moving closer each night, and if it continued that way, tomorrow it wouldn't be on the sidewalk. Tomorrow it would be at my door. Sleep had become impossible. Each time I closed my eyes, the image of that figure burned itself into my thoughts, standing closer than before, silent and waiting. My body ached from exhaustion, but the fear was stronger than my need for rest. Every creak of the house made my pulse jump. Every shadow looked alive. I kept telling myself I would call the police, but when the thought truly settled in, I hesitated. What would I even say? That someone was standing outside, not breaking in, not speaking, just standing. I knew how that would sound. I knew how easily it could be brushed off, but my instincts told me this was far from harmless. The third night arrived heavy with rain. Clouds swallowed the moon, and the sky split open with a storm that seemed almost unnatural in its timing, as if the world itself was building the same tension that had rooted itself inside me. The steady drumming of rain against the windows gave me hope that whoever had been watching might finally stay away. Rain had a way of clearing things, driving people back indoors. I clung to that thought, but deep down I knew better. I sat on the couch again, the television flickering in front of me, though I hardly paid attention to what was on. My ears strained past the noise, listening to the storm. Each roll of thunder rattled the walls, and lightning painted the room in white flashes that vanished almost as quickly as they came. At first, I managed to convince myself that tonight would be different. Tonight, the storm would protect me. But then, during one of those sudden flashes of light, I saw it. Across the street, half hidden in the sheets of falling rain, the figure stood once more. My heart stopped, then lurched painfully in my chest. It hadn't been deterred by the storm at all. It was standing there, motionless as always, facing my house like it belonged to the night itself. The rain distorted its outline, bending its shape so that it didn't seem entirely human anymore. The proportions looked wrong, too tall, too narrow, as if its body had been stretched or pulled at strange angles. Each new flash of lightning seemed to twist it further, but never enough to reveal exactly what it was. Its head tilted ever so slightly to one side, like it was studying me from across the street. I tore my gaze away and yanked the curtain closed, stumbling back into the room with my heart racing. I wanted to scream, to run, but where would I go? The storm outside was violent, and something about leaving the house felt even more dangerous than staying inside. I retreated to the bedroom, clutching the blanket as if it could shield me. I told myself not to look again, not to give it more power by acknowledging it. But sleep was even more impossible now. The thunder shook the house, and every bolt of lightning lit up the edges of the curtains, reminding me that the figure was still out there, drenched in rain but unyielding in its stillness. Around 3 in the morning, when the storm had begun to quiet, I heard a sound that froze me to the core, a faint rhythmic tapping against the glass of my bedroom window. At first I thought it was leftover rain, a stray branch brushing against the pane, anything but what my imagination conjured. But the sound was too deliberate. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I held my breath, every muscle locked in place, as if moving would draw its attention. I wanted to get up, to check, but terror pinned me down. My mind raced, imagining a pale hand resting on the glass, fingertips tapping patiently, waiting for me to respond. The sound continued for what felt like an eternity, each strike of the invisible knuckles drilling deeper into my nerves. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I strained my ears, my heart beating so loudly I thought it might drown out whatever was coming next. That was when I heard it, a slow, dragging creak, the unmistakable groan of hinges straining. The backyard gate. The sound was faint but clear, carried by the wind that had calmed after the storm. I knew that noise too well. I had meant to fix that gate for months. Now it betrayed me, announcing that something or someone had moved closer, slipping behind the house where I couldn't see. I stayed in bed, paralyzed, staring at the ceiling while dread consumed me. The storm outside had ended, but inside, the real storm had only just begun. I couldn't bring myself to check the window. I couldn't bring myself to move at all. I lay there in the suffocating silence, knowing that whatever had circled my house before was now within the fence, where the shadows were thicker and the walls felt thinner. And the worst part was the realization that if it had come this close already, it wasn't going to stop. I didn't sleep at all after hearing the gate. The sound had carved itself into my skull, repeating over and over like a warning. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the figure slipping into the yard, moving across the wet grass, pressing against the back of my house where I couldn't see. The thought alone was enough to keep me pinned to the mattress, until the first weak light of dawn bled through the curtains. Only then did I gather the courage to move. I crept through the house, every step careful, every corner checked before I passed it. The silence was unbearable, heavier than it had ever been. When I finally opened the back door, the truth stared me in the face. The gate was still cracked open, swinging slightly in the breeze. The ground was torn up, grass pressed flat in patches, wet soil smeared like something had walked circles through the yard. The air smelled damp and unsettled, the way it does after someone has just been there. I shut the gate firmly, securing the latch this time, though it felt like an empty gesture. If it wanted to come back, nothing I did would stop it. The day crawled on, and I forced myself to pretend life was normal. I cooked, cleaned, scrolled aimlessly through my phone, but everything was tainted by the memory of the night. I checked the locks more times than I could count. Curtains stayed drawn, every scrap of daylight shut out because I couldn't bear the thought of glancing up and seeing something waiting. The house was supposed to be a refuge, but it felt like a trap now. Thin walls and glass windows ready to shatter. As the sun fell again, the dread inside me grew until I could barely breathe. Each hour closer to night felt like a countdown. By the time the street outside dimmed into gray, my nerves were raw. I knew it would return. The question wasn't if, but how close it would come this time. I tried to hold out, tried to avoid looking, but the pull was too strong. Something in me needed to know, even if I already dreaded the answer. My hand trembled as I parted the curtain just enough to see through. It was no longer across the street. It wasn't even at the sidewalk. The figure was in my yard now, standing motionless just a few feet from the porch. My stomach dropped so violently I thought I might collapse. The details were clearer than ever in the pale wash of moonlight. Its clothing was wrong, stretched oddly over its frame, too loose in some places and too tight in others, like it didn't belong to the body wearing it. The proportions of its limbs didn't look right, elongated in ways that made my skin crawl. The skin beneath what little I could see was pale, almost gray, damp with either sweat or rain, though the storm had long since passed. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I felt it looking at me. Not at the window in general, but directly at me, as if it knew exactly where I stood. The intensity of that unseen gaze burned through the glass and into me, freezing me to the spot. My throat tightened, and I yanked the curtain shut with a force that shook the rod. The house suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to quiet the sound of my own breathing, praying it hadn't noticed the movement, but deep down, I knew it had. It had been waiting for me to look. Minutes passed like hours, every second stretching thin. I wanted to believe it would stay outside, that the locks would hold, that it couldn't get in. I clung to that thought until the sound began. A knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, like a polite visitor testing if anyone was home. My heart slammed in my chest, and I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 steady strikes against the wood of the front door. The sound vibrated through the frame and into the walls. I backed away, step by step, toward the far end of the room. The knocking didn't stop. It came in slow, deliberate rhythms, too patient, too calm, as though the figure knew it had all night. The sound echoed in my skull, drowning out my thoughts. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the knock still bled through, steady and relentless. It wasn't trying to break in, wasn't trying to speak. It was simply announcing itself, reminding me it was there, waiting, and with every strike of knuckles against wood, I felt the truth sinking in deeper. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was coming closer. The knocking went on far longer than it should have. It didn't grow impatient or frantic, didn't demand entry with force. It was steady, rhythmic, like a clock ticking in the dark, measuring out my fear in precise intervals. I stood frozen in the far corner of the room, my body locked in place as if moving would somehow invite it closer. Each strike of knuckles against wood carried through the floorboards and rattled in my chest until I thought my heart might rupture. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but fear clamped down on me like iron chains. Still, desperation finally pushed me to grab my phone. My hand shook as I fumbled for it on the coffee table, nearly dropping it in my panic. The screen lit up, but what I saw wasn't a message or a dial pad. It was a notification, a photo. My breath stopped cold in my throat. It was from my own camera. The picture showed me, sitting on the couch, staring wide-eyed into the glow of the television. The timestamp marked it as seconds ago. My stomach dropped into a pit I didn't think had an end. My phone hadn't left my side, and no one else should have been able to take that picture. Yet, there it was. Proof that someone or something had been close enough to capture me from inside the house. The knocking at the front door ceased the instant I saw it, as if whoever was outside knew I had just discovered something far worse. Silence swallowed the room, broken only by the sound of my shallow breathing and the pounding in my ears. My eyes drifted toward the hallway, that long stretch of shadow leading toward the back rooms, and I swear I saw movement there. A flicker of something shifting just out of reach. I dropped the phone, the clatter echoing like a gunshot in the silence. My body trembled as I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that I hadn't really seen a shadow slip across the wall. But when I squinted into the darkness, there it was again. A subtle sway, the suggestion of something waiting, like it was testing how much I could see. The realization hit me like ice water. The knocking had been a distraction. Whatever had been standing outside was no longer out there. It was in here. My skin crawled as I backed into the corner, trying to keep my eyes on every shadow at once. The house suddenly seemed endless. Too many dark corners. Too many blind spots where something could be lurking. I strained to listen, desperate for the faintest sound of movement, but the silence was worse. It was deliberate. It wanted me to know it was inside, but not where. Minutes stretched on, each second stabbing at my nerves until I could barely breathe. I wanted to run for the door, to throw it open and escape into the night, but fear rooted me in place. If I opened that door, what if it was waiting on the other side? If I stayed, though I knew it was already here with me? I forced myself to move, each step careful, my eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. I told myself I'd check every room, prove to myself it wasn't real. But the deeper into the hallway I went, the colder the air became, as though the house itself had turned against me. My own reflection startled me in the dark bathroom mirror, my face pale and sunken, eyes wide with sleepless terror. When I reached the last room at the end of the hall, I paused with my hand on the knob, heart hammering. I didn't want to open it, but leaving it closed felt worse. I needed to know. I twisted the handle slowly, the door creaking open on reluctant hinges. The room was dark, silent, untouched. Relief almost washed over me until I noticed the window. The curtain had been pulled back, the glass fogged as though someone had stood there for a long time, breathing. On the sill rested something small and wet, a muddy footprint pressed perfectly into the wood. Too small for a full-grown person, too wide to be a child's. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. Behind me, from the hallway I had just come through, a new sound whispered into the silence. Breathing, slow, deliberate, steady, not mine. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My legs locked, my body frozen as the air behind me grew thicker with presence, heavier with each inhale and exhale that wasn't my own. And then, with a clarity that split me open, I realized something that made my blood run colder than it ever had before. The shadow on the wall ahead of me was moving, but it wasn't mine.